To give you a bit of an overview of our forum panel discussion with our wonderful guest speakers, this will be followed by facilitated community feedback, and we really want to hear your insights on communicating with multicultural and diverse communities. This will be followed by some time for questions from participants to our panelists, and we'll be concluding the event at 4 p.m. Just a few reminders for everyone. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphones off, but we do encourage that you communicate with each other, that you ask questions, share any insights, just pop it in the chat section in our Zoom forum. And also, please keep your responses timely, just because we are trying to get as many responses from people as possible when we do have the community feedback. So I'm just going to pop the community questions up on the screen there, and you will have time to respond to those in about 2 to 3 minutes. And we will be coming back to them in about half an hour. I'm delighted to introduce all of our panelists today. Our facilitator is Eva Hussein, who is the director, Eva's waving away there, who's the director and founder of Polaron Language Services. She's also an interpreter and translator. We also have Dr. Erica Gonzalez, who is a senior lecturer at RMIT University for translating and interpreting services, as well as the national president of AUSIT, the Australian Institute of Interpreters and Translators. Tina Hozimi is the commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission. She is also a strong advocate for a lot of human rights issues, including refugee rights and adolescent health. And she is a research fellow at Swinburne University. We also have, luckily last, is Aurelie Sheehan, who is the manager for certification and policy development at NAATI, and she is also a French translator. So I've got up on our screen just some of the themes and topics we're going to be talking about in our panel discussion, and we will be coming back to these shortly. We also have Camilla Paz, who is a designer and illustrator, and she's going to be doing something a little bit different today. She's actually going to be illustrating what we're talking about in our forum. So I'm delighted to see what she comes up with. And I'll be handing over now to Eva, who will be talking a little bit more about co-design. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So I wanted to give people that are participating, as well as our panelists, a bit of background information as to why we're doing this session in the first place. Because I think most of you will agree with me that we are a pretty complex world with many, many challenges. And of course, communication is one of them. Multicultural communication is even more challenging. So we often call upon collaboration to solve problems, but often we stop at the consultation stage and never progress to active participation and implementation. So once we've seen the rise of co-design as a concept in many different settings, multicultural communication is not one of them as yet. Well, not much anyway. And we know also that significant resources and money is, they're being spent in this space by governments, but we're still seeing failures. So I think, today's session is not going to solve all the issues, but we want to get the conversation started. And we're very grateful for everyone participating and giving us their views and opinions. But let me explain to those of you that don't know what co-design is. So it's the act of creating actionable ways to improve current situations or find new solutions, but it's done with stakeholders. In other words, people that will be using whatever we're developing. So this means service users, customers, patients, but also creators, so translators, interpreters, organizations like NAATI, training institutions, and of course yourselves, people that have come today to watch this session, but also contribute. And the main participant, I feel, of a co-design should be the community, because if you think about it, the translations we do, they don't go on a wall in a frame. They are to be used by community. They are to be used by community to make decisions. Sometimes it's a matter of life and death, as we're seeing with COVID. So the people that the information is for are very important stakeholders in those conversations. But it's not just about consulting with the community. I think it's fair to say everyone's sick and tired of consultations, actually. It's about community and about having genuine, sincere conversations. So it can also be the first step in understanding what the problems are. Co-design, I feel, also has the effect of empowering people to be active participants. And as I already mentioned, I feel that multicultural communication, if you call it a problem or a challenge, is not something we're going to be able to solve today. We're going to be able to talk about it and start the conversation. So why did we invite you? Well, to tell us what you're seeing in the community. So whether you're a translator, community leader, whether you are from RMIT or Victorian Multicultural Commission or NATI, or you're perhaps a client of translation services, we want to hear from you. And one thing I would love for everybody to walk away with is the co-design mindset. So thinking about, okay, who do I talk to really understand what the community needs are? How do I, contribute to that conversation myself? And we'd like you to share ideas and, develop a common language so that we can co-create better experiences for people who use translation services. So, and, that collaboration that I've just mentioned, it could be a difference between something working and something not working, right? And, it's also fair to say that I think in our industry, often decisions are made about us without us. So again, this is an opportunity to start the conversation. We're going to be creating an impact report. And whenever we can meet face-to-face, we'll do so at another forum. As Stephanie said, we had to move online, which is both good and bad. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Eva. We'll be moving into our panel discussion now. So our first question is, what role does your organization play in communicating with diverse audiences? And I'll let Eva decide who's speaking first.
You can all go at once if you want to, but I'll start with orally. NATI is an organization that's been around for decades now. And I know that you've gone through a very significant change in how your organization is perceived, and not so much what you do, but how you do it. So tell us, what does NATI do for those of us that don't know? And what is your role in communicating with multicultural audiences?
Yeah, sure. So NATI is the national certification body for translators and interpreters. So basically we design translation and interpreting tests for those individuals who aspire to become professional translators and interpreters. So we are setting a minimum standard for the industry. And I think the way, the role we play in communicating with diverse audiences is well summarized in our mission statement, which is building a connected community without language barriers. So I think that's a very good summary of what we are trying to achieve there. And by setting that minimum standard through NATI testing, we're also giving assurance to our end users that they're engaging with professionals whose expertise has been validated by a national test, a national standard, really. And also with our new certification system, which we've started to implement since 2018, professionals who become certified by NATI need also to recertify their credentials every 3 years. So they have to do that and meet some requirements on their professional practice, but also professional development. So we can ensure that the professionals who are certified keep maintaining their expertise and can keep providing a quality and consistent service over time and across languages as well, because it's a standard.
And of course, orally, much of it is work in progress because we live in such a fast-moving world. And I think some of your challenges are enabling new languages to be tested and practitioners to do the right thing. There's all kinds of challenges there ahead of you. But let me just introduce you and ask Erica Gonzalez to speak. She's a woman that wears two massive hats. One of them is OSIT, one of them is RMIT. Erica, what does a training institution and a professional body do when it comes to communicating with diverse audiences? What's your role? Can't hear you unmute.
Yes, in my first role as the national president of AUSIT, which stands for the Australian Institute for Translators and Interpreters, which is the national professional organization for translators and interpreters. So basically, we stand for ethical, competent, and informed practice, and we promote the code of ethics. We provide professional development of high quality, and also we endorse research and support adequate remuneration and working conditions for our members. So it's basically a professional forum where the members can, join and basically be part of a profession that is striving for high quality standards. And then as an educator, my job is to actually make sure that everyone who graduates is ready to pass the NATI test. And to me, being a translator and interpreter is more than just sitting a test. So the prerequisite to comply with training before sitting the test was very welcomed by obviously educational institutions, because in other professions, you would not consider someone for a job unless they've gone to university or they've got some basic and foundational training in their discipline. So we make sure that the students go out to NATI with good translating and interpreting skills, but also with solid theoretical foundations and a good knowledge of the code of ethics, so that we then, when you, Eva, engage these professionals, they can provide you with the highest possible quality.
Of course, and you've recently reached a very big milestone at AUSIT, which is 2,000 members, which is quite incredible, because when I was involved, we struggled to get, I think, 700 people. So your organization has also undergone a very major change, I guess, in the last few years. But let me just talk to Tina, because Tina is a commissioner at Victorian Multicultural Commission. Tina, what is your role, or your organization's role that you're representing today in communicating with diverse audiences?
Thanks, Eva. Well, I guess the Victorian Multicultural Commission acts as a conduit between multicultural communities and the state government. So our role is kind of twofold. We share information on behalf of the government to multicultural communities, but then we also work with communities to better understand I guess, their thoughts and views and any barriers they're facing. So any feedback that communities have, we pass on to government. And being that we are a trusted voice within the community, we are the first point of contact for many community leaders for that sort of information from government. And as a result, we're quite a valuable resource to government around sharing that information. So more recently, during COVID and information sharing practices, when things worked and didn't work, we were the group that would often hear a lot of that feedback and make sure that we can convey that to government and be more involved through their CaLD Communities Task Force around communications and translations.
And Gina, what would you say is your biggest challenge as an organisation right now?
In terms of translations and information sharing, I guess. Sure. I mean, there's quite a few challenges that I wanted to raise. One is that we heard a lot from community members around the fact that a lot of community members don't necessarily read or write in their language or have limited digital literacy. So it was important for us to convey that to government around the importance of sharing information on multiple platforms, using community leaders, using translators, using multiple platforms, and not just having traditional media used in the same way that it was before. It also is important to consider subgroups who have different needs and different ways of accessing information. We've got younger people from our communities who are often more digitally literate, and then you've got community members who are from refugee backgrounds who may often get information from caseworkers. So it's important to make sure that you've got hard copies of things, but also have digital sort of formats of things. Timeliness of translated materials was another big issue that came up, particularly around COVID, if I'm thinking of those examples. We had a lot of people that had a lot of trouble accessing information in a timely manner, but there was also a lot of stigma and fear. So I think it's really important to address some of those challenges. People told us a lot that they didn't just need to know the tagline or the key messages, but they actually wanted to understand, why are we being fed information about vaccinations? Why are we being fed information about getting tested? And it's really important to convey that information and understand how to do that when you're trying to get translated materials out really quickly. One other thing that came up was that when you do have official languages, when we have talked to people in the community, they often aren't always accurate around real experiences of people, depending on where they've grown up geographically, where they've learned a particular language and dialects, and that often hasn't been translated into something that they could use, depending on their levels of education or literacy levels, or ability to read and write that language varies quite a bit. So understanding communities and their needs has been one of the bigger challenges, I think, around this space.
Thank you, Tina. And Erica, having met you, I know what a passionate advocate for the industry you are. And often, I guess, translators, interpreters are the meat in the sandwich in this kind of conversation, where the governments need to communicate something very quickly, and they are at the very bottom of the chain. And I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm a translator, interpreter myself, but it often, the value of the work that we do is often underestimated. And, apart from the fact that most interpreters get underpaid and translators, whatever, we won't talk about that today. But what is the biggest challenge for practitioners who are to deliver this information that the governments want us to deliver?
So basically, one of the things I believe that it's one of the major challenges still in 2021 in our profession is that the lack of acknowledgement in regard to the skills, abilities, and competence you need to produce a high quality translation. And it's very important. And Eva, thanks for giving us free range in this debate.
Because whatever you want.
Yes, you can be straightforward. Still, we are seeing translations which are of very poor quality in very popular languages such as Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and that's unacceptable. We've got one of the best certification systems in the world, and OSIT works very closely with NATI. And still, what's happening? There's a missing link where we've got extremely well-trained, certified practitioners, and still we are seeing these poor quality translations that then obviously the community receives, and that generates a lack of trust, lack of engagement with the messages the government is trying to produce. And I think it's very important to have these uncomfortable conversations because something's not working. When we contact providers and say, look, we've identified all these errors in these translations, and they say, oh, we do the right thing. We engage NATI certified translators, we do revisions. Like, well, then what's the problem? Because the result is here. I've just gone through it and I found grammar mistakes, style issues. So that's our challenge, how we communicate with those who organize procurement processes, those who make the rules really, so that we can engage those top practitioners who have their certification, who either have been qualified at a university or vocational education center, or those who have heaps of experience and are actually extraordinary at what they do.
Right. And I think, from the point of view of a language service provider, I'll tell you that often, and I'm also going to be very open and transparent, Erica, often when we quote for particular services, we lose out to the cheapest provider. So I think there's this drive to the bottom of the, bottom dollar. And quality is the last thing on people's minds, because what I find is that in a lot of organizations, translations aren't part of the strategy, right? So when you do translation as an afterthought, as the last thing on your mind, of course, it's not going to be a good experience, right? But so you already know, so you certify translators, and it's a very robust process that requires people to pass a test, and there are entry-level requirements that you've tightened, and I think the system is the best that we've ever had. So that disconnect or that gap that Erica just spoke about, where does that come from?
It's a very good question. Well, first, before I answer, I just wanted to say I agree 100% with what Erica was saying in terms of raising the awareness as to how highly skilled translators and interpreters are. This is not about being bilingual, and it requires a lot of technical skills, and often they're not recognized enough. And it's really unfortunate that we see those bad translations out there when we know we've got everything to provide those best professionals. As to us at NATI, the challenges we meet, and I think this is probably directly or indirectly linked to what Erica was saying. I think one of the biggest challenges we meet on a regular basis is around supply and demand. So when we work on our development plan around which languages we are going to make available for testing, we look at a variety of criteria, and some of these include humanitarian trends, migration trends, but also community demand. What for instance, the gaps identified by language service providers who are in desperate needs of interpreters or translators in a particular language. And so what the paradox we actually met with quite often is that we make those languages available for testing, and we have a very little demand for testing while there's a screaming demand on the market. And I'm not sure I have the full answer to that. I think there might be something around training opportunities. There are people out there in the community who might aspire at becoming a professional translator or interpreter, but they have only limited training opportunities because there's no language-specific training available to them. And so they have to turn towards non-language specific training or shorter courses and not a full degree. And perhaps they're not even able to become eligible for an actual test or even to enter the market fully and provide that quality service. So I think there might be some of that. At NATI, we do have a partial answer to this, which is our recognition credential. So the recognized practicing credential is offered to translators and interpreters for languages where we're not able to offer testing. So there is still an option out there for them. And this is basically what we look is at any training component they might have done, and it might be a skill set, an online skill set, which is not equivalent to a master's degree, but we'll be looking at some training components if they meet our intercultural and ethical competency requirements, and also we'll be looking at any professional practice they might have done in their language. But there are, yes, some discrepancies, I think, at the training level and what's available there. So it's not something NATI can fix as such, but we do have some mechanisms in place so we can still include those people in the workforce.
Right. And Erica, could I get you to wear your university hat for the moment and tell us what are some of the challenges at your end, I guess, in getting the practitioners ready to pass the NATI certification test?
Well, I have to say that I always believe that universities also are there to serve the needs of the society. How many more Chinese interpreters can we use? That's the thing. And look, and with all my, obviously, due respect to my lovely Chinese students as well, who some of them actually go back home and actually work in more commercial environments. But if we focus on Australia, as an educator, we also have to stick to, academic, pedagogical constraints and sometimes budgets within departments. And at RMIT, I took the difficult or complex path because we thought, okay, we've got enough interpreters in these languages and still subsidize the rest of the languages, but we started offering languages that are needed in the community at tertiary education level, at master level. That means that sometimes we've got a couple of students in class with two teachers, one teacher who is the language specific teacher, and then a really seasoned tutor or teacher with them, because also in some languages you don't have enough talent, if you like, to deliver. They might be certified, but they are not teachers. So it's a real challenge. And believe me, I've had lots of sleepless nights over this, because this is also something that puts pressure on the budget. Those up the top who might be academics in fields completely different to translating and interpreting do not understand, why do you have 15 languages? Can we just have 4? And I'm like, no, because these 4 you're telling me to deliver are well catered for in the society. So now slowly, I think we are getting a recognition. More students are passing the NATI tests and are getting employed as soon as they finish their degrees, because obviously the community needs them. So it's obviously a long and slow process, but we are getting there. So I think the university has a very important role to fulfill in terms of the needs of the society. And obviously we need to transmit that message to university administrators and people higher up the ranks, so that we can actually fill in that void.
Right, but I guess also to the students that are investing time and money into a degree whereby they may not be able to get a job. But Tina, I wanted to ask you, so what Erica and Aurelie basically describe is a bit of a misalignment with what's needed on the ground and what NATI and universities can provide in terms of talent, as Erica's described it. What are you seeing on the ground? How are these gaps, how are they being closed by governmental initiatives, I guess, or what is VMC seeing in that regard?
So, I mean, I guess we're very much aware of a lot of the challenges that Erica and Aurelie have described. I think it's quite clear that there are things missing in terms of what people are asking for and then the final product that is being delivered. And it's quite clear that often in terms of some of the successes that have come out of, I guess I'll use COVID as an example, given that that's what we're sort of more closely working with at the moment. We found that sometimes people were complaining about translations being too literal or not being easy to understand. And we found that actually going back and making sure that the English version was a lot clearer and simpler, less acronyms, less abbreviations, less punchy and punchlines, thinking about very simple English and thinking about how it would be more meaningful to the people that will actually use the resources. And so I guess we found that we started to get better feedback from communities when they were accessing some of the resources, when it was clearer and when they were supplemented with audio or visual content that could be shared by community leaders. I think one of the biggest challenges that has come out of everything is also not only do you want the resource to be well developed, you also want to make sure that it's meaningful enough for community members to utilize. There's no point in having this beautiful glossy resource that's on a website somewhere that no one's ever going to access, but you do want communities to feel a sense of ownership or some sort of investment into actually wanting to use that resource and share it around. So we found that when things were developed in a way that had visual audio content, if it was an image or something that they could even share, a distribution for us has been something that we've been working quite closely with, something that can be shared by things like WhatsApp groups or that sort of space. So I think what's worked well with us is that we've had a lot more points of contact with communities along the way to get that community feedback, to get that sort of checkpoint. And whether it's been through community stakeholder engagement by Zoom sessions, I know the government's even developed WhatsApp groups with community leaders to share that information and get live feedback. And having opportunities for people to provide feedback and actually taking that on board has been quite helpful. We've also found that I think what you've mentioned before around the budgets is quite important too. And we've stressed that there's no point in doing something half-heartedly with a very low budget. You might as well not do it at all if you're going to almost offend people with something awful. And people, you do lose their trust because they often realize that you're not investing in that genuine engagement to meaningfully make sure that what you're producing is actually helpful. So there's been a lot of learnings, and we sort of hope that engaging the right people along the way has helped. I know we also have made sure that we had relevant content experts. So if you were working with communities, you had GPs or professionals or teachers or lawyers, whoever it might be that is also a professional in that space, having them involved in some of those processes when it's relevant to the content, but also having them involved in disseminating that information and sharing it was also quite helpful. If you've got someone in those communities who are trained professionals and they're the ones also involved in delivering that information, you've got trust, you've got that respect that people have and potentially more engagement from those community members.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. And Erica, one of your success stories, I want to say, I hope it's still the case, is the scholarship program. Or is it a success story? Because we've moved on to, we've only got about 10 minutes. So it's been the most interesting discussion that we've had so far. But is the scholarship program a success? And what are some of the success stories, if it is, out of that?
Yeah, of course. So obviously quality is a shared responsibility. And as I said, to avoid those gaps in the market, it's the educational institution's responsibility, but also those services who are actually using translating or engaging translators and interpreters. So for example, in Victoria, we have a very solid scholarship program where the government lists a set of languages that are needed in the community, and therefore they fund the vocational education of interpreters and translators in those languages. That's for the vocational education sector. But then in OSIT, for example, we have collaborated with NATI, and in states like, for example, Queensland or Western Australia, we have funded the training of interpreters and especially interpreters in certain languages. So I think, as I said, quality is a shared responsibility, and just by working together with stakeholders such as NATI, language service providers, governments, we will be able to actually address all those needs that Tina was highlighting. Because at the end of the day, obviously, profit is a big issue. We are all working for organizations that obviously need to make a living, but also if we can integrate that social aspect of the needs the community has by funding translators and interpreters in those languages where we don't have anyone qualified or certified, that definitely helps a lot. And also we are creating jobs, we are generating employment, and that's obviously a success story.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing that we forget sometimes is that we need to keep jobs in Australia. We talk about this in many other contexts, but you know, at the height of COVID, I was so disappointed to see that work was being sent overseas by the governments. And I think, you know, when interpreters had no work. So for me, that was quite a shock, actually. But Aurelie, what is something that NACHI is most proud of in the last 12 months? What's an example of success, you know, when it comes to multicultural communication from your space?
Well, I think I can answer that from different perspectives. And I'd say even since 2018, since we've introduced the new certification system, I think that has been a massive success. Obviously, it's still being rolled out, but we've been able to create more consistency across the certification we provide, noting that before 2018, our former system had different, how do I say, it was, for instance, for all practitioners who had certified before 2007, they didn't have to undergo any recertification process. So they didn't have to engage into maintaining their professional development or their practice. And then everyone who had been accredited after 2007 had to revalidate. So we had different standards within our certified, our accredited pool of practitioners. So I think moving to the certification system and making this consistent with a recertification process for everyone is a big success, because directly or indirectly, it does have a consequence on how we communicate with our diverse audiences, because we're able to maintain that level of professionalism at all times. So I think that is a massive success story. But just following what Erica was saying, NATI has been working alongside OSIT and other training institutions as well through our Industry Development Fund and our Research Development Fund. And we've been funding a variety of projects ranging from supporting the development of a skill set for Auslan interpreters to supporting a project around translation of official documents. We've been funding, I mean, there are many, I won't be able to name them all, but we've been funding projects around training for interpreters working in dementia situations. So, and, you know, there are many others. So I think that is also a very positive outcome of all the work that's been done lately.
Amazing. And I think one of the things that stands out for me is that NACHI as an organization is much more approachable and accessible to practitioners, to everybody. And you know, anytime we need anything from NACHI, the answer is yes. So that's quite a difference between you know, how it used to be. Tina, we've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to divide these 5 minutes between you, Erica, and Aurelie by asking you our last question, I guess, which is, tell us just one thing that we can all do to make communication better for diverse multicultural communities.
If we're just highlighting one thing, I would say involve communities. Before any campaign, before any project that you're working on, take the time to understand your audience, understand the age range, understand how they engage with material, understand what barriers or fears they have around the messaging. If you're going to provide information about family violence, understand specific stigmas that community has. It's not enough to produce translated information that is just literally the English to the language that you're talking about, but understand what information will that community need to actually understand and want that information and address some of that stigma. We need to think about the why a bit more, I think, when we're actually translating information, so people actually engage with the material that they are being given. And that way, if you build those relationships with communities, you also get your champions, you get your community ambassadors, you'll get people that are invested in what you're trying to do and share, and they will be more likely to disseminate your messages and correct any misinformation that they then gather while your information is going out. And if you don't have those relationships, work with partner or community agencies, work with bicultural workers, community health champions, whoever it might be, who actually have those existing relationships.
Look, I so agree with you, and I also think that there's a lot of waste in the system where we seem to be spending enormous amounts of money on stuff that people can't access, stuff that people can't read, they can't understand. And I think, you know, the translation dollar should be better spent, personally. Erica, what about you? You have about a minute and a half to tell us what we could all do to improve our communication with multicultural communities. One thing.
Well, yeah, I think Tina has summarized it beautifully. So, but from a translating perspective, I would say that basically get the messages that the community is going to read. So get the brief of who your target audience is. Very important in procurement processes, please. Go for quality and not quantity, because I think Eva made a really important point about that. And I'm very happy that I've been actually dealing with the NATI board of directors, and they've been very supportive about that, to just go to the highest spheres to, you know, basically work with people who have power to make these things better or change the policies we've got around procurement processes. And obviously this is not going to change in 2 days, but at least we're working towards it. And I think that that's vital, to engage companies who actually really believe in quality, because that quality is going to transmit into trustworthy messages for the community and our target audiences.
Yeah, that's such an amazing point. And look, I have been in this situation. So nowadays we call that lived experience. But, you know, when I came to Australia, it'll be 36 years. It wasn't even the language issue. It was the system, lack of knowledge of the system issue for me. And I think I'm still, you know, I've been a translator since 1993, and some things we are not doing better. So I think, you know, having that conversation and just, you know, asking your service provider, okay, who is working on my translation? Give me their names, give me their CVs, give me their experience. Who are they? So that it's not a faceless industry with, you know, which is transactional and really just, you know, we end up producing stuff that people don't read. Orally, Nati's got quite a few compliments today, which is interesting and very pleasing to hear. You have the last word, and you have a minute to do it in.
Yeah, sure. I think Erica and Tina have summarized it very well as well. For me, I'd say that educating the end users is very important. Because there's often an understanding that translators or interpreters are only bilingual people, they're not skilled professionals. Mm-hmm. I think raising that awareness and making sure they understand what's needed for them to deliver the best message is very important. And in saying that, I'm thinking about the COVID, the situations we've had around COVID-19 and the use of Google Translate. Mm. And I think this was a really good example of the importance of using professional translators. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use technology, but we should make sure certified professionals are involved in the process, even if it's at the checking stage, to ensure we've got a quality output. I think that awareness needs to be raised even more.
Thank you, Aurelie. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Tina. I haven't even got in trouble with Stephanie because we're right on time.
Perfect.
But can I say that all your views were so on point and so important to consider. And I think I, for one, feel better that I have people that understand, what we're talking about in this space. And I think we got quite a few comments from people cheering us on, and we will continue this conversation. Please stick around, because we're going to be asking you to give a little summary of the session. But I'm now going to hand over to Stephanie for the next lot of whatever. What are we doing? Remind me. I'm nervous.
So we'll be going to the community feedback very shortly, but I'm just going to stop sharing my screen at the moment so we can have a little bit of a look at Camilla's artwork that she's got going on there, which looks amazing. Thank you so much, Camilla. And we will be coming back to this at the end so we can have a little bit more of an in-depth look at Camilla's designs there. So we will be having our community feedback now. We do want to hear from you. We've got a few rules just to begin with. So if you want to respond to any of the questions, just use the raise your hand button on Zoom. Introduce yourself quickly, and then you have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to the questions. So here is our first question coming right up. Sorry, everyone. Just having a moment. Here we go. So can you think of some examples that worked for your community?
And why is the other question. So if you want to speak on this topic, please raise your hand. There's a button at the bottom of your screen. And when we see your hand raised, we're going to give you about 2 to 3 minutes to speak on it. So the question again, what are some of the examples of good practice, of what worked, and why did it work? And I think Andrea's going to lead us through this conversation. Who do we have, Andrea?
All right. Let me just have a look. We have someone that raised her hand, and that's Sambat Liverwell. Sambat, if you can just unmute yourself now and introduce yourself and answer this question very quickly. You're going to have about 2 minutes to answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Somebody from Liverwell, and I'm working with we call party population teams, and we do a lot of translations all the time because we want to get our messages across to communities. And our practice is here in Australia as well, like in Cambodia as well, because I'm from Cambodia. Peer review process is a good thing because whether translator is a native qualifier or not, but if we do not get the translation through the peer review process, I'm gonna get a lot of errors, because through my experience many years, because translator just quickly translate things and then sometimes do not understand the whole context, So our translation at Liverwell, I get all the translation reviewed by a volunteer or a peer reviewer. So you have to get to review the translation. So it worked quite well because we can correct some error or can just raise some appropriateness or understandable of the translation. So peer review process is a good thing.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing. And I do know that liver health is an issue for many communities and also communication in that space, because there are lots of misleading information out there. So I think by having a peer review, someone who's either have had a lived experience or is able to provide the translator with extra support, I guess, in crafting that message is very important. Thank you, Sambat. Andrea, who else do we have, please?
Sorry, let me just have a look again. So we have Hasara. She wants to speak at this stage. Hasara, if you want to unmute yourself and please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hasara. I actually work for Polaron as the Relationship and Growth Coordinator. I come from a multicultural background, so I'm kind of used to growing up in that sort of context and working within the community. I found that making it enjoyable and something that is relevant to how the community communicates with themselves is really useful. Growing up, we had a lot of events that were very catered to our cultural community. I come from a Sri Lankan background, and celebrating like religious cultural events and kind of bringing information into that context was really useful because everyone was comfortable and willing to speak rather than just having that awkward conversation outside of what they're comfortable in. So I think it's just really important to understand how people respond to certain information and how you can kind of ease that information between people. So if you know the conversation is going to be difficult, maybe you can present it in a way that makes it useful to them in other ways. You know, is it entertaining if we do it this way? Is it more likely to resonate with people if we do it this way? So I think just understanding the dimensionality of everything is really good. You know, understanding that there's different layers to each thing.
That's a really great point. And I think one point that I wanted to make before we move on to the next question is this, that the way that we communicate, you know, in the last 5 years has changed enormously. And particularly when it comes to young people, but not only young people, it's often assumed that people that are older don't use the internet, which is just not true. I have a 95-year-old uncle who's got a Facebook page, and therefore crafting of those messages that you spoke of needs to also take that into consideration, that yes, you can translate into 57 languages. Yes, you can put it on your website. Can people find it? The answer is no. So I think rather than translating everything for everybody, we need to think about who we want to talk to, why and what about, and how to present that message in a way that's actually going to resonate. And not only that, that whatever information you're trying to present or communicate to the community that is trying to speak to is actually going to be acted upon. That's the issue, that the main challenge that we've had with COVID, where, you know, there's so much misinformation, and by producing messages in a way that people can digest easily, like, you know, like me and you, works best. Yeah. But thank you for your contribution. Sorry, I didn't mean to take over. Thanks, Zara. Okay, so I'm hoping that this question is going to elicit a lot of very passionate discussion, because I want to know, what have you seen that's a failure? And whilst we're gathering people to raise their hands, I'll tell you what, because as I mentioned earlier, I've been a practitioner, translator in the Polish language since 1993. With COVID, there was a lot of confusion about terminology. And, in the Polish language, we have had a few discussions between, our colleagues about how to translate, let's say, COVID vaccination or whatever it is. And I was so disheartened only last week to see a mistranslation in Polish. And it's a very simple thing. What the translator, I don't know who it is, translated for a governmental piece of content was, rather than vaccination against COVID, that translated it vaccination for COVID, okay? Implying, between the words that if you get vaccinated, you'll get COVID. So it's just one word, but it makes a very, very big difference. And I think what happened there is that translation was never checked. So regardless of the fact that whoever's translated it made a mistake for whatever reason, there was no process for feedback or quality control behind the scenes. All right, so hopefully there's lots of examples. Andrea, over to you, please.
Just also a reminder on Andrea's behalf that for people to use the raise the hand button, that's how we'll get this all running.
Okay, wonderful. Okay,
thank you. We have Lucy Best now. She wants to speak about the failures to communicate with multicultural audiences. So please, Lucy, you can unmute yourself and introduce you.
Hi there. Yeah. So I have joined a project. I'm Community Education Officer for Seniors Rights Victoria, and we're working with Polaron on some videos, and I discovered a fatal flaw in the videos, and that is that not only is it very sort of white middle class people in the video, but there's people talking about case studies instead of sort of showing the story. So the dubbing, although Polaron are doing an amazing job at making sure that the language is relevant, it's very hard to make the visuals relevant. So thankfully we've secured some more funding, and for future videos we're going to have less like visuals of people's mouths saying the language, so it doesn't look so incongruous when the language gets dubbed into other languages. So I'm going to have stories being shown with voiceover of the, the legislative information that we're trying to communicate to make it easier to dub. So yeah, that was a big, quick learning curve for us.
And Lucy, I think this is the best type of failure where we learn a lesson. I love that because I think, we do not need to know everything there is about translation because we're learning as we go along. I mean, it's such a fast-paced space with technology and also we need to produce these things fast. So I think as long as we can learn a lesson, as you've said, then our job is done, even if it's a bit of a failure, right?
Thanks.
Thank you, Lucy. All right, who else have we got?
All right, one sec. So we have Muckles. He just raised his hand. If you could please unmute and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mukhlis Habash. I am a community leader for refugee background Iraqis. I am also part of Regional Advisory Council for VMC, and also I just finished interpreting course with RMIT. The failure that I found, especially with the COVID, the pandemic time, was the translation materials doesn't work for most of our communities. The audio and video message is more appropriate to easily to achieve better outcomes. Also, what I found failure is most of, like if can say, small organization who is working with CaLD communities using unprofessional or not certified NATI interpreters and translators. I think because they are part of their staff, and that given a very poor rendition and like reduced trust with this information. Also, sometimes the media or the material, translate material, speak to all. As Tina said, we have to subgroup people. So if we want to like target elders, we have to speak other language than young people, or yeah. So this is the main issue that I found, especially with the pandemic time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mukhlis. And that's a very powerful point that you've made there. And what I wanted to add to that, if I may, is that service providers, governments, everybody that wants to communicate with people need to look for creative ways of doing so. And we've covered that a little bit, I guess, throughout the discussion. But, people use different channels of communication. Everybody's got a phone pretty much, but not everybody's got a phone, if you know what I mean. So I think, whilst we have to change the way we communicate, we still need to continue engaging with people the old school way. At the moment in Victoria, we can't speak to people face to face, but normally that's also one of a really good ways of taking messages to the community. There's also community radio, community newspapers, and I think hopefully we've now understood that it doesn't, that it takes more than just putting something on a website that you've translated. All right, Andrea, more questions?
Yeah, so we have a lot of not questions, but answers or comments. I guess people is a bit shy to speak, but we have one person, Carolina's now saying, the work I do evolves around artists and arts and community engagement. My budgets are very limited. For fluidity, we use Google Translate amongst us and between the communities. I guess we do not have something public, so it is not relevant to this forum. I just wanted to share how it is in the field I work in.
Yeah, of course. And look, Carolina, I think that's a really good thing to discuss, because, there are tools out there that can be used for different things, right? If you want to just know the gist of something, I think, Google Translate's perfectly fine. And as you pointed out, sometimes it's a matter of money, and if you don't have it, it's the best tool that you have to communicate. And I think the only thing I would raise there is that we discourage, automatic translation such as Google, because they also breach people's confidentiality. So I don't know if you know this, but whatever you put into Google, they own it. So, you know, if it's just for, you know, getting the gist of things or a basic discussion, that's absolutely fine. And I think that the technology has moved on massively over the last few years as well. It's just that, you know, there are instances where it's not appropriate. You know, for example, the Victorian government and other governments, including federal, have got language services policies, and in it, automated translation is listed as not something to use when you need to publish important information in any way, shape or form. All right, over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Mercedes Dent, she wants to speak about this question. Mercedes, if you can just unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mercedes Dent. I work for a community services organization called Carers ICT. And I have a good example of something that went really, really bad. It is federal agency called the Carer Gateway that launched in April last year, and all the material of the Carer Gateway was translated by professionals. However, in the Italian translation, let me go one step back. As you know, there are many words that do not translate in other languages. And the word carer, the way how we use it in government and community services, does not exist in Italian. But if you put the word carer into a dictionary, the closest thing that will come is something that then back into English will translate into a support services person, not a carer. Support services are paid, carers are unpaid. So the translation made by professionals for the Carer Gateway said translated carer as badante. And unfortunately, if you have lived in Italy after the 1990s and you know what happened and what the connotation of the word badante is, it could have a really negative connotation. So when I send the feedback to the Carer Gateway about this, because the translation was done by professional translators, they did not take the suggestion as a valid suggestion. I had to send proof, but I did send proof, because if you speak Italian and you put badante in Italian, you will definitely understand what the word means. And then they had to pay extra because they had to retranslate everything. So that is, if you don't do it right the first time, it's going to cost you more.
Right. Mercedes, lots of very valid points. And I just wanted to tag on to them by saying that often whatever the governments produce goes through layers of checking, you know, so whether it's a brochure or part of a website or an app, there is a quality control method behind the scenes that, you know, lots of levels of approval. So I think if you give it to one translator, whether they're NATI certified or not, there's a very high risk that they're not going to do justice to something that several people have worked on. And this is why it's really important for language service providers and also for translators to have a checking mechanism or quality control mechanism, because, you know, I'm a translator, I get my work checked because I know that I make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are not really of any consequences, but other times they are significant. And whether it's vaccine for COVID or vaccine against COVID makes a big difference. But you've made an excellent point. And I think, you know, that feedback loop, if there's anything we could tell the governments or the purchasers of services, translation services, do not hide behind NATI, because yes, somebody may be NATI certified, that we're not questioning that, but you're only as good as your last translation, right? Yep. That's what I would say. Okay, thank you for your contribution. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question, and that is, how do we connect the different players? So today we've been able to show you is the complex picture of the translation industry and I guess how communications develop, and this is just one aspect of it, of course. But how do we connect the different players to have better communication? What are some of the ideas that people might have?
All right, thank you. We have Dominic who wants to speak about this question. Dominic, are you able to unmute yourself now? I think Dominic's having some issues with his microphone now.
That's all right. We might move on to the next person. And whilst we're waiting for that to happen, the issue is, of course, that there are many players and there are many agendas and there are many priorities, and you know, we want that translation dollar to be spent as well as we can in that. You know, we should, in my opinion, we should translate fewer things but better. So, you know, how to connect the industry players. I think this forum is one such opportunity where we are talking to each other, and you know, hopefully it's not just going to be a conversation but something more than that. And I think, you know, having honest conversations, and what Erica and Tina and Aurelie have shared is already you know, very useful for me as a language service provider, of course. How are we going there, Andrea?
Yeah, so we have Hassara who wants to speak about this question.
Okay.
Yes.
Go for it.
Just to add on to what Eva was saying, I think transparency is key as well. I think if we encourage conversations sort of from the beginning, where we openly talk about how we can better communications, I guess, just like this question, I think we encourage people to see things from a different perspective. So I definitely think just understanding that things have evolved and there's different ways of doing things, and it doesn't always have to be done the way it's always been done.
Yeah,
can really help with this aspect.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'll just say here too that I am looking forward to the day where translations are signed with translators' names or the service providers' names, because why should we be hiding behind, you know, whether it's NAATI or training institutions or whatever. I think that transparency that you're speaking of is absolutely essential because, you know, we know of practices that aren't fantastic. I don't want to call them dodgy, but I will. I just have. So, so I think, you know, working with Australian translators is really important for one main reason, and that is that they understand the local community, they understand the local language. So what Mercedes has mentioned, if you are translating for all the Italian people that have lived in Australia for 50 or 60 years, the language necessarily has to be different. Because you're talking not to young Italians, you're talking to people that have lived here for a long time, and their language has probably stagnated a little, if I can put it that way, or you know, it's just not the same. And people that don't understand the context will not be able to do justice to that. I think we've got quite a few comments in the chat, Andrea. I'm just wondering whether we could maybe read them out.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a comment here from Marta Menendez, and she's telling us it all comes down to making funding available for checking, community consultations, focus testing as well. Pradeep is telling we need more people like Erica, who is part of many organizations. She's able to highlight the issues to different organizations. And Carolina, who's from the artist organization, yeah? She said, I was not talking about producing documents, rather developing community arts and cultural projects as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, technology is there to be used. And, you know, I certainly don't want to be critical of anyone that does, because it's a good thing to have. And, you know, when appropriate, I use Google Translate too. All right, so I think we've got quite a few really good ideas. We move on to the last question, which is, what more could we do to improve our communication for multicultural communities? And I would really encourage people to contribute, but just remember that there will be a survey that we're going to be sending to people after this session. But if anyone would like to speak on this topic, I strongly encourage you to do that. Andrea, do we have anyone that wants to contribute?
Please, just reminding you guys that if you want to speak, just raise your hand and we are going to give you a chance to speak. So we have Sambat again who wants to answer this question. If you can just unmute yourself, Sambat. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to speak. Hello.
Ah, here's Dominic.
Hello. So I'm going to try and answer this question. Look, we've looked at a lot of this already during the session, but the best thing you can do, that you can all do, is talk to the communities. It's always find out from the source what they need to hear and how they need to hear it. We've talked also a lot about budgetary constraints and how it costs money to do this, but the cost of not doing it is much worse. So I would always start with say less, but say it well. Say it as well as you can and be as targeted as you can. So rather than have 1,000 words to say something, have a picture and 10 words. But talk to the people who know best, community leaders, people that you know, bilingual workers, and so on.
Thank you, Dominic. And I think some of the points that I think earlier Erica's raised about who are community leaders, look, you need to get all kinds of perspectives, and it is very important not to hijack the message that you're trying to promote. So let's say it's about family violence. Of course, some community leaders may have particular views about that. So it's really important not to rely on one particular source, but go to get lots of different point of views. But thank you, Dominic. And I think we have Sambat as well that wanted to speak. Go for it, Sambat.
Hi again. Thank you for the opportunity. So you use the word communication, but if we talk about improved communication is broader than just translation,
Yes.
Because translation is one thing, but communication is a broader thing,
Mm-hmm.
But it involves involve picture, make things fun and more pictorial, because different brochure, they just text heavy, So even you translate it correctly, nicely, but it doesn't guarantee that you can communicate it with community. So if we're talking about communications, it's more than translation, because make things more fun and mixing more pictures, more videos, more animation, may communicate well with community rather than just sending text,
Absolutely. And look, I so agree with you, Sambat, because, from my own backyard, I don't read as much as I used to. So the information that I consume needs to be shorter. It needs to be more targeted. I want to know who, when, how much, where do I go to get this, I think earlier on we spoke about glossy brochures. Nobody wants to read them, and it's a waste of money. It's a waste of resource. And I think when we talk about presenting information in different ways, what you've just said is precisely that. We need to think about different modalities of how the information is presented, but also different channels. We shouldn't assume that people have computers at home, but on the other hand, a lot of people do have phones. So, targeted, smaller and less expensive messaging is the way to go, because we it's all taxpayers' money anyway. And I think we're getting quite a few messages. So we've got about 2 minutes. I might just quickly read them out.
So we also have Leah who wants to speak about how to improve communication. Leah.
Excellent. Go, Leah.
Thank you for fitting me in, Eva. I just wanted to mention as well, picking up on the point that it is also very much about intercultural communication and not just translation. But I think what we're proposing is also thinking about creating a multilingual communication strategy. So what we have found ourselves in is a crisis situation caused by the pandemic. And this has happened in other parts of society as well at different times, floods in Queensland, for example, where we suddenly need to channel communication into a range of different languages very, very quickly. And I think if we work with government and key stakeholders to think about developing something like a multilingual communication strategy that does not let the urgency dictate the translation, but rather focuses on the needs of the multilingual audience, then we might be in a bit of a better position to combat some of these changes in a more systematic way. And I think that translation experts very much need to be part of these conversations in helping to build strategies that focus on intercultural communications. And I know the government has done a huge amount of work in improving communications in this area, but I think the more that they can work with translation specialists, and I'm sure that Erica would be more than happy to put her hand up, as would myself and colleagues at Monash, but I think that would really help to push things along. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, Leah, can I just stop you before you go away, because I have read the article that Mark Orlando, you and Rita Wilson wrote, And it is by far the best thing I've ever read about this particular topic. And I was cheering, it's come up on my feed on LinkedIn, and I was cheering on, and I'm like, finally somebody said something that I don't have the words to say, because you guys are academics. So if anyone wants to read it, it gives you such a honest but also practical way of looking at this issue. And I strongly encourage people to read it, and we can send it to participants. But that was really well thought through, I thought, as a practitioner. And even Erica's agreeing, even though she's from a different training institution. So there you go. But well done, Leah. And I'm sure that it took a long time to write it, and maybe a little bit of guts, right?
We actually only had a day to write it. So, but it was something, look, it was something that we've been thinking about for a long time. And as you say, it's something that I think is needed to be put into words in that way. So we're more than happy for you to circulate that. And again, anything that comes out of this, we'd be more than happy to comment on.
Beautiful. All right. And our wonderful friend Nadia Chavez has posted it, so people can can click on it in the chat box. And being the chance master that I am, I have to hand over to Stephanie because we are out of time.
Thank you so much, Eva. So we will be moving on to our, not the summary just yet, but we'll be moving on to our Q&A. So if you have any questions for our panelists, now's the time to ask them. You can either raise your hand or you can pop a question in the chat if that's easier as well. And while you're thinking of your questions, we do have Camille's beautiful drawings up on the screen at the moment.
So I'm just going to try and describe them a little because Camilla can actually speak, but Camilla is an amazing designer. I don't know if you can see those designs too well, but when it's finished, we'll make it available to everybody. But I think we're seeing a happy world, and a few people that aren't too connected to the community. So I think the word community is definitely something that is popping, and also level of future translation. And I can't quite see what that says, but there are some buildings holding hands. Is it? No, bridges. We're building bridges. I think that's what it is. So when this drawing's finished, we'll distribute it to everyone as well. All right, so now I think we're heading towards the last bit of the session, and I do want to thank everybody that's contributed. And we'll hand back over to Aurelie, Tina, and Erica for a summary, I guess, of what they heard, and you know, just a wrap up, I guess, is the way to put it.
We do have some time for a quick Q&A as well, if anyone has some questions first, just before we summarize. I think Sambad might have a question.
We have someone from the Somali Women's Development who wants to speak. If you could please unmute yourself and give us your comment. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Zainab Sheikh. I just wanted to add the last question about how to engage the community. And if I speak on behalf of the African community, the best way that the communication to engage with them, I think, is in terms of translations. There's a lot of organizations in the community who every day they do translation for and interpreting for free for their community, and because some of the community, they have that trust and that you know, the private, like it's the other professionals who are already registered, they keep the privacy, but the community perspective, they prefer to engage with those community they know and ask them that kind of help. I think if you guys could engage local community organizations who support their communities, in terms of whether they're doing good or not, you can get more, I think, from them.
Okay, thank you. I might actually go to Erica to comment on this, because I have a feeling that she might have very strong views about what we just heard.
Yes.
And I think what Zainab has said is, you know, communities react to the need and communities react to gaps and also maybe to potentially a bit of lack of education about what an interpreter's role is. But Erica, would you like to comment?
Yes, by all means. And obviously, again, as an educator and the head of a professional association, I completely oppose the use of family members, of community members to work as translators and interpreters, because they lack the very complex skills we need to translate and interpret in a professional manner. Of course, these communities are filling a gap that we've got there in the society. And obviously, we cannot disregard the work they do, but it's not the right way to do things, because we've seen in the past there's plenty of empirical research which shows that the employment of people who are not professional interpreters can lead to serious issues that jeopardize the well-being of people, to the point that in some cases in hospitals there's been cases where people get extracted the wrong teeth or cut the wrong limb because they didn't have a proper interpreter. Interpreting, look, I've got a bachelor's in translating and interpreting, a master's degree, I did a PhD, and I'm still learning. I'm still, recertifying. So it is really hard for someone who has just and MIA bilingual skills to do a job that is up to the standards that are required. And why is that? Because as I said, when we're providing community translation or interpreting, we're working with people that in some instances, or who in some instances are in very vulnerable situations. And these interpreters who are members of the community are not aware of the OSIT Code of Ethics, of issues like confidentiality, impartiality. They haven't studied discourse that happens within the medical or legal settings. Would these people be able to interpret accurately in a cross-examination in court? Would they know how lawyers construct the questions and what the aim of each type of question is? If you don't interpret properly, you might be jeopardizing or putting at risk the case of that person. So obviously, without disregarding these people who are trying to help, because I believe that this comes from lack of knowledge and education around our profession, I think that these practices should be completely abandoned, and we should actually support these communities so that these people actually get proper training and actually can become interpreters and be remunerated accordingly.
Thank you, Erica. And of course, the point that Zainab has made there too is that communities are worried about confidentiality. So there's still quite a bit of work the interpreting profession needs to do to promote the fact that, everything's confidential in our interpreting exchange. But it is a very complex issue, of course. We do have a couple of questions of culturally and linguistically diverse seniors. And as the conversation's heating up, I think, which is great, I love it. Let's talk about what more we could do to the seniors. We had two people pointed out that, like the way that we communicate with people that are older that might potentially have issues of, very complex need. They might be very frail and elderly. They might have, even dementia. What can we do to communicate with them better? Tina, can I find you there somewhere amongst participants? Would you like to contribute?
Sure, thanks, Erica. Thanks, Eva. I think based on the feedback that we've gotten from communities, particularly around the pandemic, we found that more use of radio has been helpful for older groups of CaLD community members. It tends to be a bit better for them because people have conversations. It's a little bit slower than actually putting a video through and getting them to listen to that, particularly around digital literacy. Given that they don't all have access to mobile phones, as people have mentioned, radio and community newspapers are ones that we've been hearing about that people have used for information gathering, but also thinking about places of worship. So people that are going to churches or mosques or wherever they're sort of going, you've got religious leaders and community leaders that have access to some of these individuals. So thinking about where people who are a bit older hang out and spend their time and utilising that a bit better is what we've found works.
Okay, and thank you so much, Tina. And I think, you know, some of those tips that you've given us are pretty simple, but yet very, very effective. And I think what works for one community might not work for another. And I think it's really engaging with, you know, whether it's the faith leaders or community leaders and, you know, a variety of people, you know, to help that isolation. Because I think what I found is that, you know, in a time of a pandemic, when language is an issue for some people, that's an extra layer of isolation actually from everybody else. So I think lots of very important points. The other question that we have here is, do you have any tips on working with interpreters to help optometrists, GPs, nurses to engage with migrants and refugees? I think one of them would be telehealth, but perhaps, Tina, you have some other ideas. So it's harder to provide language services over internet for all kinds of reasons, and it's also very tiring for interpreters, so let me tell you. And also the expectations are that they can work back to back for 8 hours or whatever it is. It's really difficult to do. But I think telehealth has come in handy when we can't leave and we can't go. How are we finding working with interpreters through video at the moment? Do you know anything about that?
I think it has been a challenge for people, particularly when you don't have that face-to-face visual cue and that interaction that people can have. What we found has been helpful is actually working with people and reinforcing the importance of cultural competency training and highlighting things like that to relevant health professionals, but also working with them. A lot of this stuff is challenging at the moment because everything's very time sensitive, but when we do have more opportunities to plan ahead, I think having more engagement with nurses and GPs and optometrists to think about the nuances of various communities and the needs that are quite varied, and acknowledging that diversity within diverse communities is quite important. So in terms of that, I think it's really around building relationships and having those conversations in a well thought out way.
And also understanding the role of different stakeholders, because you have bilingual workers, you have interpreters, you have facilitators, there's all kinds of all types of people that can contribute to that picture being better for everyone involved. And I think, you know, the one thing I wanted to mention is TIS, which is Telephone Interpreting Service. It is a government agency, so that sits under Home Affairs, I think, at the moment, or Department of Immigration. And it is a free service for GPs, for health professionals. It's just that people don't use it. Okay, that's the truth. It's fully funded, but you do need to be aware that the interpreter is going to add to the time that you have your consultation with, that you have to book them or whatever it is. So some people are a little bit reluctant, but it's a resource that everybody should tap into because it's available. And yes, good point, Nadia. The number is 1300 131 450. And absolutely, this is for health professionals ranging from doctors to nurses. It's just that, you know, perhaps people aren't so keen to do it when it's available. Okay, and Nadia, our champion of diversity, is putting all kinds of resources in the boxes there. All right, what I'm going to do now is hand over to Aurelie just for a few words. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to, before we have a look at the artwork that Camilla's, yes, sorry, Eva, it's such an exciting discussion. I know, I've been shouting and speaking at a very fast pace for the last, you know, an hour and a half. So I know something about it. Thank you. Can we get you, Aurelie, what is it that you want to say, sort of wrapping things up? What did you learn today?
Well, thank you very much first for having me today. It was really great. And I found very enriching to hear from the community because we don't get that opportunity all the time. And it's really good to hear what's happening there and what the needs are. So I think for me, what I'm taking away with, based on all we've said, is really to keep, to maintain and continue and consolidate the partnerships that are already happening, be it between NATI, AUSIT, training institution, but also with government bodies. I think that's the key for us to to have better outcomes, really. So I think that's what I'm taking away, and it's great to have that panel together today, because we can really see where the connections are and use that to work together in the future, together in the future.
Thank you so much, Aurelie. And Nadia's just mentioned that service users can also book, and well, no, they don't have to book. They can use telephone interpreter, just a phone, and ask for a particular service provider, and that service is free, and people are encouraged to use it, of course. So look, we've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to use it just to tell you a bit of a story. I'm not a great storyteller, but when I was 18 and I came to Australia with not a word of English and all of that, I was actually 7 months pregnant. So my son is going to be 35, I think, this year. So I went through some hard times, but I gave birth at a hospital that doesn't exist anymore. It's the Queen Victoria Hospital in the city that's now Queen Victoria Centre. And there was an interpreter there, Teresa, who's still practicing. I think she's about 150, to be honest. Don't tell her I said that. But she was my connection to everything. She was able to orient me in the system. And when you need an interpreter and you have an experience like me, so she's inspired me to become one, actually. But when you need to navigate a system that you don't understand, interpreters and translators can be lifesavers in a virtual sense. And I think what came through this session today for me is that we should most certainly respect them more, pay them more, listen to them more, but also get connected with the community at a really genuine, sincere level where we ask them, okay? Yes, we might have an argument or a difference of opinion, and maybe some people prefer community to do interpreting. Erica's going to shout at us for that, and rightly so, in my opinion. But, we need to know what's going on at a grassroots level to be able to do something about it. So as we getting the picture from Camilla, we've got lots of diverse faces. That's Camilla. She will finish this into a beautiful artwork, I promise. It already has got the makings of something quite special. So I'll use the last few minutes to thank everybody sincerely for your time. I know everyone's busy, and I know that we have all kinds of priorities and essentially jobs to do. So this is an extra. This is something I truly appreciate on behalf of the 18-year-old Eva that was pregnant and needed to use an interpreter. So every time we do translation and, every time my staff, my team, the people that I work with, deliver translation, we think of the 18-year-old Eva who was pregnant and he was in a hospital. So with that, before I start crying or whatever will happen next, I wanted to thank everyone for your contribution, but also Stephanie and Andrea for helping out and for really seeing this vision. So we're not going to be able to save the world, but what we will do is create an impact report, and we're going to send the survey to everybody, because not everyone's good on camera, and people might want to put things in writing, and out of that we'll create something that will get the conversation started. And thank you so very much everyone for taking part.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks, Aurelie.